Okay, epistemic injustice. This is a concept that comes from a Miranda Fricker, but it's sort of taken on a life of its own in contemporary, feminist thought and in epistemology. Epistemic injustice is the idea that you can be wronged as a knower, right? So that certain things can happen to you that make it so that, for example, maybe people won't listen to you because of the kind of person you are, or how you're identified in a society, or maybe you're just deprived access to certain kind of information that's really necessary for you to understand the world you're living in or your own lives, or even just to be able to kind of seek for the good life for yourself. So we'll talk about this concept. That's the task for today. There's two main kinds of epistemic injustice according to Fricker. She claims that there's a difference between what she calls testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. I've got some other examples in here that don't fit very well into either of those categories. So absolutely make sure you understand these two types of injustice, but don't think there's sort of like, this is like the end all be all of this. I think there's lots of ways people can be harmed as knowers or epistemically. Um, so what is epistemic injustice? It's when somebody does a wrong to you as a knower or as a transmitter of knowledge, right? So we in some way deprive you of your right to stand up and express your own knowledge of the world and communicate it to others. So sometimes that is a way you can wrong somebody, or we just wrong somebody as somebody that it has the capacity themselves to know things, right? And there's a ton of different ways that can happen. So being unfairly judged to not have the knowledge or reasonable beliefs that you have based upon unjustified premises, that again would be a kind of way of depriving you as status as a knower and as a transmitter of knowledge. Um, I'm going to talk about gaslighting as a kind of epistemic injustice. I don't think that fits into either of these categories, but I do think is a kind of epistemic injustice. I'm also going to talk about some things that happen because of uh, algorithm bias, and we'll talk about that too. Okay, when we think about knowledge claims, right, and we've been talking about knowledge a lot this course, probably one of the main sources of most of our knowledge is testimony, right? Like you think back at like all the stuff like even basic math skills, right? Like how do you really know that say 2 + 2 = 4? It's not like you figured that out on your own, right? I mean, you might have, but probably what happened is you had teachers in school and then they walked through and demonstrated those things to you, right? Or maybe your parents did when you were young. Uh, and if, yeah, yeah. So for a ton of things that we think we know, right? The reason why we think we know those things is because somebody told us. We had somebody that we thought of as a reliable source of testimony, and then they communicated that information to us. And that testimony gives us justification for believing a whole bunch of things that we believe about the world, right? Um, it's one of the many reasons you want to have a reliable media source, right? And you want to have a reliable government source, right? Like if the information that's being given to you by your news sources is biased or politically motivated or prone to being full of errors, right? Then you can't rely on them, right? Then your news is no longer a source of testimony. And incredibly effective propaganda technique, right, is to kind of make people question the veracity of their news sources. So if you live in a society where you can't rely on your news, it's really difficult to just get just get reliable testimony of what's happening in the world because everything is suspect, right? Likewise with your governments, right? Like if you can't go into a government website and get like reliable statistics or reliable information about disease or about like, the economy or just the kind of things that governments report on, again, there's the most reliable, supposedly most reliable sources of testimony in your society when it comes to certain types of facts are up for grabs, right? And that puts you in a situation where just as a knower, as a citizen, as a person that has to make decisions about policy and who to vote for, you're radically compromised, right? So that's one of the many reasons that's such an important thing to have in a well-functioning society or in a just society. But yeah, testimony, we have to rely on it whether we like it or not, right? So much of what we know about the world is because we interact with others, because others know things and they share that information with us, right? Probably most of what we think we know is a result of testimony, right? We say testimony is credible when there's good reason to believe that what's claimed is true, when the person is who's testifying to us knows what they claim to know, right? And then the question is how do you know whether or not the communicator actually is credible and what they're communicating is reliable? And we have a bunch of ways we do that, right? Like usually, I don't know, like if a professor says something to you, because professors has a certain kind of status in our society, you probably think, well, that professor probably knows what they're talking about. So what they say about the subject that they're talking about is reliable, right? And we should take it seriously. If a professor goes outside their lane, right? Like if I'm talking about philosophy, it's I certainly am going to make mistakes, but you can say, well, he's a reasonably reliable source of information about his academic discipline. If I start talking to you about, biology, it's not that I'm going to be unreliable. I've, done some work in the, history and philosophy of science. So, you might think, well, he might know a little bit of what he's talking about, but, if I'm contradicting somebody that works primarily in the biological sciences, you should definitely take what I'm saying as likely false, right? Or, it's not a good source of testimony. And if I start talking about, chemistry or something that I know nothing about, right? You should not rely on then I'm not a good source of testimony. And we're like that with everybody, right? Um, One of the reasons it's so problematic to have, say, celebrity academics, right? Who, because and we talked about this when we were talking about bullshit the other week, right? When you're in the public sphere, you get asked to talk about just things nonstop, often things that you know nothing about and things that you have no opinion about or should have an informed opinion about. And when you get a celebrity academic, somebody like, say, Jordan Peterson, right, who made a career out of, writing on Carl Jung, right? So and legit, he wrote a book about Jung, and I'm sure he knows a lot about Carl Jung. He would be a reasonable source of testimony about that, right? But that's not the main thing he talks about. He talks about politics and gender and like the meaning, like all this other stuff that he has no more qualification to talk to than say your crazy uncle, right? But because of his social status, right? Because he's an academic, there's a kind of he's a professor, right? So there's this, and even if people sort of in parts of our society are kind of very skeptical about academics today, there's a kind of social clout that goes along with being a professor. And so his words are amplified in a way that they probably shouldn't be, given how unlikely they are to be reliable about the topics he's talking about. But I mean, there's lots of other ways you might become a credible source of testimony in our society, right? And I think one of the interesting things about the, say, social media age that we're inhabiting is that what makes somebody a reliable source to the, say, general public has changed significantly, right? We give influencers far more credibility than they're probably justified in having, right? than they are justified in having, right? Like some random person with a YouTube channel suddenly gets to be an authority on all sorts of things, where really you should be going to people that have where there's legitimate reasons to think they're credible. And this isn't a video or discussion about that particular topic, but it's worth thinking about. All I want to get here is just look. Testimony is one of the main sources of knowledge we have. Testimony is typically thought of as reliable, and that's normal. But we evaluate the reliability of testimony by looking at how credible the speaker is and how likely it is that they're going to have that they're going to know what they're talking about, right? And we all just do this all the time, right? Like as a kid, you rely on your parents. As a little bit older kid, you rely on your schools, right? When we get a little bit older, you start relying on your peers, right, and so on. Testimony. We want to talk about epistemic injustice, right? So ways in which we're wronged as knowers. What testimonial injustice is when your testimony is judged to be less credible based on, say, prejudice, right? And not because of anything about what you're saying being unreasonable, not because of anything about, say, you lacking the right kind of status in that society to be giving people reliable testimony about that, but it's because of prejudice, right? It's because people are concerned about, say, your economic status or your professional status, your sexuality, your legal status, your gender, your race, those kind of things, right? That's when you're wrong when it comes to testimonial injustice, when people won't listen to you because of who you are, right? And it's not relevant to the kind of testimony that you're giving. Again, it's relevant, I think, if you want an expert opinion on medical advice, that the doctor you're talking to is a medical doctor, right? I shouldn't be giving medical advice, and you would be not performing testimonial injustice if you didn't listen to me when it came to medical advice, right? You should listen to a doctor. So that's not testimonial injustice. The who I am in that circumstance matters, right? But testimonial injustice is when we're prejudiced against somebody in a unjustifiable way in the domain we're talking about. Tons of examples of this. Probably the most obvious example I can think of is, when you say you silence somebody at work because of their gender, or so silence a woman at work, right? So imagine a female board member. To her predictions about what is going to happen to the business are rejected due to the prejudices of her male colleagues, right? They just don't listen to her despite the fact that she says something, right? Or she says something and then, the male guy, the guy right beside her speaks up and says exactly what she said, right? And then they listen, right? That would be an example of silencing somebody at work. That's an example of testimonial injustice, right? So no, or if you had a black board member or something like that, or even a white board member, right? And people are just like, oh, I don't want to listen to this white guy, right? That's testimonial quieting. That's when you don't listen to somebody because of who they are, despite the fact that they have a position where you should be listening to them in this domain. People sometimes do this to themselves, right? So testimonial quieting is when we don't listen to somebody because of who they are. Testimonial smothering is when you keep your mouth shut because of who you are, right? So you can imagine somebody that's on a board. Again, let's just say it's an entirely male board, for example, except for the one woman on it, and she decides she's not going to speak up, right? Or she's going to be very, very careful about how she says something if she shares anything, simply because she feels that, and she might be unjustified in feeling this way, but maybe she just feels like nobody's going to listen to her because of who she is. That is what we call testimonial smothering, right? Both examples of testimonial injustice. Another example, dismissing racialized voices. So you can imagine a jury rejecting a defendant's testimony because they believe that people of certain races are untrustworthy. Maybe a cop being skeptical about the testimony of an Indigenous eyewitness because of their own personal biases against Indigenous people. And there's lots of fairly reliable reports about this kind of behavior happening all over the place, right? This is, I think, one of the reasons why certain industries have invested so much in things like DEI training, right? Because you don't want a cop, for example, right, that has unconscious biases towards people in terms of their race, right? Because you want them to be impartial. And even if sort of we overtly are like, well, yeah, we are impartial, I'm not racist, right? If you do have sort of unconscious biases towards groups, you might just unintentionally, right? Or maybe intentionally, but you might just not listen to them because of who they are. That's an example of testimonial injustice, right? You should, in these kind of circumstances, be trying to get as much accurate information as possible, and typically it's not it's just not correct to dismiss people on the basis of their racial voice or their gendered voice or something like that, right? That's the idea there, right? So dismissing somebody simply because of their race or sex when you're collecting information. This can happen in ways that impact white men, right? And it's worth sort of noting about all these cases. We're not sort of picking on a particular, often these kind of discussions, that's what happens, right? But that's to sort of misunderstand what's going on here. You can dismiss somebody's voice because they're a white man as well, right? And that would also be dismissing somebody on the basis of sex or the basis of race, right? That's the idea here is you don't listen to somebody because of who they are, right? Because of their race or because of their gender. Even though what they have to say is relevant to what you're looking into, right? And so if you leave those voices out, you're just as guilty of this kind of thing, right? So that's worth keeping in mind. And then a final example we've got here is, we got two examples. Final example we're going to look at here is expert skepticism, right? So this is when a doctor or nurse, a healthcare provider, a lawyer, whoever's the expert in the field, doesn't listen to somebody because they think they know better because they're the expert, right? So, maybe a pregnant woman comes in and she's got health concerns, and the team of medical providers doesn't really listen to her, and they go, oh, you're just depressed. It's just postpartum depression. And she might be like, no, I have this legitimate, this certainly seems legitimate to me that I've got this, whatever it is, right? I've got this pain or I can't sleep, whatever she's talking about, right? If they don't take her seriously, that's a kind of testimonial injustice. Or healthcare provider rejecting the health concerns of, say, a recent immigrant, maybe thinking they're exaggerated, right? Rejecting medical concerns of teenagers. Oh, you're just here trying to get drugs from me, right? You don't really need this. Um, or often, because we come from different teaching cultures, right? And so relationships between students and teachers are often different across national boundaries, right? You might have a recent immigrant that fails to challenge a teacher's clearly false statement in class because they believe that they are not supposed to be challenging authority in the classroom, right? And so they just smother themselves, right? They don't speak up. That would be, again, an example of expert skepticism as a kind of testimonial injustice, right? Um, Gaslighting and hermeneutic injustice. Those are the two more we need to talk about. Gaslighting, that phrase was coined 1938. Patrick Hamilton play. In the play, Bella marries a man named Jack, who's after her money and her jewelry. And so what he does throughout the play is try to make her question her sense of reality so he can have her institutionalized and gain full control over her wealth, right? And of course, that concept's today taken on a life of its own, but it basically means the same kind of thing, right? It's when you are in a relationship with somebody, typically, a romantic, but it can be in social, it can be in economic, it can be in employment. Like, it doesn't have to be tied to your romantic relationships. But it's when you're in a relationship with somebody and they make you question your reality, and they make you question your own status as somebody that can know things, right? And there's hundreds of different ways people do this, right? And as young people, you're probably much more familiar with the ways in which somebody might do this to you in a relationship than I am. Right. But this is, when somebody rewrites history. I mean, these are all very, very successful, very standard propaganda techniques, right? Um, where you discredit somebody, everything they say, you go, everybody kind of thinks you're crazy, you need to calm down, right? Or you're overreacting, you minimize their perspectives, right? But yeah, this is gaslighting, right? We use this informally to describe somebody who persistently puts forth a false narrative, which leads other people to doubt their own perceptions. Gaslighting, a little more formally, is when one agent seeks to gain control of another agent by underpinning the other's conception of herself or his self as an independent locus of judgment and deliberation, right? So you gaslight somebody when you try to, in a lot of ways, infantilize them, right? Or make them so that they themselves don't feel like they are competent to make calls about their own lives, right? Where they themselves see them as unreliable, see themselves as an unreliable source of information and decision making. Um, Again, I think this is probably a kind of testimonial injustice, but this isn't relevant. It's sort of a third kind of epistemic injustice, right? This is a way of undermining somebody as a knower, right? We see gaslighting in relationships. We also see it all over the place in political propaganda. I've talked to this, right? But gaslighting is very common, something to be aware of.